In 1933, Germany was a broken nation. 6 million people were unemployed, and the military was cash-strapped. Soldiers were forced to train with fake tanks made of wood and canvas to simulate a real force. Within a few years, that image was replaced by a carefully crafted display of prosperity. The Nazi regime pointed to full employment and the promise of a modern consumer lifestyle, epitomized by the mass-produced people's car, the Volkswagen. This wasn't a standard economic recovery. Behind the scenes, the country's industrial capacity was being funneled into a massive rearmament program, turning foundries into the primary source of a new, high-tech war machine. But this growth didn't come from sound fiscal policy or a miracle of productivity. It was a massive expansion of state spending, funded almost entirely by credit that the country didn't actually have. By basing the economy on a military buildup it couldn't afford, the regime created a cycle where expansion was the only way to avoid bankruptcy. To keep the system from collapsing, the state would eventually be forced to look beyond its borders to find new wealth to steal. To pull this off, the regime turned to Hjalmar Schacht, the head of the central bank. Schacht had to find a way to pay for massive, illegal rearmament without printing so much money that he triggered the same hyperinflation that had destroyed the German economy in the 1920s. Schacht's magic trick was the Mefo bill. He created a dummy company with no employees and no products. When the state ordered tanks or planes, it didn't pay in cash. It issued these secret IOUs through the dummy company, effectively creating a parallel currency that was hidden from the official national budget. The strategy worked in the short term. Because the debt was hidden, the regime was able to ramp up military spending from roughly 1% of the national GDP to 20% in just 5 years. But these bills were still debts. By 1938, the secret IOUs had accumulated into a mountain of credit that was set to come due. The government had committed itself to billions in payments that it had no way to settle using its actual tax revenue. By the eve of the war, the Nazi economy was a trap. The state either had to default on its secret debt and stall, or it had to go to war and use military force to seize the resources of its neighbors. The first solution was domestic robbery. Through systematic violence and the night of broken glass, the regime began seizing the assets of the Jewish population. Bank accounts, businesses, and personal property were confiscated to provide an immediate injection of cash for the state. But even mass theft at home wasn't enough to sustain a war machine that was burning through iron, rubber, and oil. To keep the factories running, the regime needed raw materials and foreign currency that only existed outside of Germany. Conquest became a logistical necessity. As the military moved into Poland and France, they weren't just seeking territory, they were conducting a systematic sweep of foreign assets. Gold reserves, coal, and massive stockpiles of grain were seized and shipped back to the Reich. This plunder allowed the regime to maintain a high standard of living for the German population. By effectively subsidizing domestic life with stolen foreign goods, they ensured the public wouldn't feel the economic strain of the war they had started. In this system, military victory was the only way to avoid domestic austerity. Every new territory was a fresh source of capital, providing the grain and gold required to keep the German economy from imploding. The limits of plunder were reached in 1941. As Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the war became a multi-front struggle against the world's largest economies. The easy wealth of occupied Western Europe was gone, and the costs of the conflict began to outpace the rate of theft. To solve the resulting food shortage, Nazi planners designed the Hunger Plan. They calculated that by diverting grain away from Soviet cities to feed the German army, they would intentionally starve millions of civilians. In their ledgers, those lives were simply useless eaters, whose survival was a logistical burden. By 1942, Armaments Minister Albert Speer faced a massive labor shortage as German workers were drafted to the front. His solution was an alliance with the SS to turn the concentration camp system into an industrial workforce, replacing millions of citizens with slave laborers. This was performance feeding. Managers used spreadsheets to calculate the exact number of calories required to keep a slave laborer alive just long enough to extract a specific amount of work. When a worker's output dropped below the cost of their rations, they were allowed to die and were replaced by the next shipment. This was the final stage of the Nazi economy. By measuring human life in calories and integrating mass death into the logistical process, The regime created a system where industrial production and genocide were two parts of the same balance sheet. In its final year, the regime sacrificed its people's future for more time, diverting chemical resources from fertilizer into the production of explosives. It kept the artillery firing for a few more months, but it ensured that the following year's harvest would be a total failure. When the surrender finally came in 1945, the currency was dead. The billions of Reichsmarks printed to fund the war were worthless. In a landscape of rubble, the economic miracle ended with a population forced to trade their remaining possessions just to eat. For a time, money was replaced by barter. In a country that had once prided itself on advanced industrial engineering, the most stable form of currency became a pack of real cigarettes. But the physical machinery survived. Because of the massive rearmament buildup, Germany actually ended the war with more industrial capital and machine tools than it had when the war began. The infrastructure of the war economy remained, ready to be repurposed for the post-war world. The Nazi economy shows how a modern industrial state can integrate mass theft and industrialized murder into a functioning logistical system. It wasn't an anomaly of madness, but a chillingly rational pursuit of production at any cost.